tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive. Welcome to another episode of Thinker Sensitive. Thank you so much for listening. Today we're going to be talking about the importance and the value of consistency. One of the standards that film critics use to evaluate whether a movie is good or not is coherence. Even when evaluating a fantasy or sci-fi film that is based on fantastical or mythical themes and ideas. A film can be unrealistic and yet still be consistent, displaying internal coherence and logical consistency. That is, the rules of the fictional or imaginary universe are consistently followed throughout the unfolding of the plot. The Lord of the Rings trilogy could be an example of this. Of course, elves, orcs, hobbits, and trolls don't actually exist in real life. But each character in the epic trilogy acts in accordance with the unique attributes, qualities, and characteristics of his or her species, demonstrating coherence and consistency in congruence with the rules and the laws of the fictional universe, which are laid out in the script. I have always been preoccupied with consistency and coherence, as inconsistency and incoherence have always been personal pet peeves of mine. I'm sure this has something to do with my educational background, but I think it just also has to do with who I am by nature. In college, when I wrote papers, I felt the need to logically connect every single idea and every single sentence in my essays. In order to do this, I would use various introductory clauses at the beginning of each sentence. So, for example, therefore, thus, for this reason, because of this, with this in mind. I was trying to explicitly demonstrate the consistency and coherence of my thought process through these introductory clauses. I did this until one of my professors finally told me that, though I was a good writer, my papers were very burdensome to read. I definitely have a hypersensitivity to consistency and coherence, and so I know that I represent one side of the spectrum here. But consistency and coherence are really important, partly because they relate to notions of justice, fairness, impartiality, and truth. When I interact with media, news, and public communication today, I can't help but notice a lot of incoherence and inconsistency in thinking. The examples abound. For instance, some might say that they're strong advocates for tolerance, yet they happen to be intolerant of everything and everyone that they disagree with. In other words, they're only tolerant of ideas and demographics that they appreciate, which isn't tolerance at all. A journalist might be a staunch egalitarian, yet she gets upset when she works harder and better than her coworkers, but gets paid the same amount. A conservative radio host might hate it when athletes speak out about social justice issues, believing that they should just focus on their sport. But he has no problem when they speak up about their religion. A CEO of a big tech company might advocate for free speech in her society. Yet she uses her power and influence to censor opinions that she doesn't like. A TV personality might oppose unpeaceful protests, but immediately calls for riots when something happens in a society that personally upsets him. An employee might hold the belief that all corporations are inherently evil, while working for a corporation that offers benefits and provides opportunities for free education. A religious organization might strongly oppose the endorsement of subjective, non religious ideologies in public schools, but would celebrate the endorsement of subjective religious ideologies in public schools. We could go on and on with examples here, but I think you get the point. These were all examples of inconsistency and incoherence on a micro level, in terms of individual arguments and views. But let's talk about consistency and coherence on a macro level for a bit. Everyone has a worldview, whether it's subconscious or conscious, implicit or explicit, developed or undeveloped, detailed or undetailed. A worldview is an overarching view of life, understanding of the world, and an ecosystem of belief, including opinions on fundamental questions of life, values, priorities, morality and ethics, truth, meaning, origins, existence, identity, etc. Not all worldviews are equal when it comes to coherence. Some people, and some worldviews in general, do a better job of putting the pieces together and connecting the dots. Consistency and coherence on a macro level corresponds, at least to some extent, to consistency and coherence on a micro level, though it's not a guaranteed safeguard. The less defined, developed, and structured a worldview is, the more susceptible it is to inconsistent and incoherent thinking. There are worldviews that by nature are more unified and connected, and there are worldviews that by nature are more fragmented and disconnected. In my opinion, religious worldviews and theistic worldviews are more unified than non religious and non theistic worldviews. Even many atheists and agnostics would agree with this. And this is one of the reasons why I'm a theist and why I'm a religious person. To get a little philosophical, the main reason is that God is the unifying unity of all reality. God is the universal that unifies all individual things, the unifying factor of all reality. So when you take away God, the universal, you're left with the individual, or better yet, individuals. You're left with a bunch of fragmented and disconnected individual and particular things. I also personally believe that hypercritical epistemologies, that is, the philosophy of being super critical, even paralyzingly critical, about our ability to know things and ascertain trustworthy knowledge, lends itself to disunity and fragmentation as well. Philosophical deconstructionism and nihilism, two systems that are based on a hypercritical epistemology, both lead to inconsistent and incoherent thinking on both a micro and macro level, and also tend to lead to underdeveloped worldviews. In short, this is because hypercritical epistemologies are intrinsically self-defeating. The critical nature of the viewpoint undercuts and undermines one's own viewpoints, including the viewpoint itself. Deconstructionism is inherently self-deconstructing, and nihilism is based on both systems of thought. Nihilism is based on both deconstructionism and a hypercritical epistemology, deconstructing all values, destroying all connections, and fragmenting all reality. It should be of no surprise that nihilists tend to be common culprits of inconsistent and incoherent thinking. Nietzsche, the father of modern nihilism, whether he wanted to be the father of modern nihilism or not, is a great example of this. If you're someone who values consistency and coherence, Nietzsche is a very difficult read. Now, let me pause here and make a very important clarification. I want to be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. Having a theistic or religious worldview does not make one immune to inconsistent and incoherent thinking. One can possess a unified worldview and still make inconsistent arguments and hold incoherent ideas, and vice versa. In other words, coherence on the macro level, having to do with worldviews, does not necessitate coherence on the micro level, having to do with individual ideas or arguments or opinions. The other thing to point out here is that coherence does not equal veracity. Consistency doesn't equal rightness. Consistency and coherence are good first steps towards truth, and they're good measures for truth, but they don't necessitate truth. My earlier example of The Lord of the Rings highlights this. The story is coherent, but it doesn't mean that the characters in the story or the plot of the story correspond to reality. Valid arguments in logic are good examples of this. Just because an argument is valid, and therefore just because an argument is consistent and coherent, doesn't mean that it corresponds to reality and is true. So, why does this type of inconsistency happen so often in our society? And why should we care about being consistent and being coherent? Some inconsistency is certainly the result of misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge. But human bias is often the most prominent cause. All of the examples of inconsistency that I gave in the beginning of this episode are based on personal bias. Bias breeds selectivity, and selectivity breeds inconsistency. We see this in workplace ethics sometimes. I might think it's completely unethical for my manager to wear a Bernie Sanders t-shirt at work. But I might be completely supportive when the CEO of my company wears a Make America Great Again hat. Could my ethical selectiveness and my inconsistency in thinking here have something to do with my personal political bias? We should care about being consistent and coherent because we should care about being just. To be biased and to show partiality is to be unfair. To be inconsistent is to be unjust. If we truly care about justice, then I think we should care about being consistent and being coherent. I think we should also care about consistency because of the issue of hypocrisy. Selectiveness and inconsistency in thinking often lead to hypocrisy. Again, all of the examples of incoherence that I've given in this episode are also forms of hypocrisy. And this relates to character. The consistent person is more likely to be a person of integrity, honesty, justice, and faithfulness than the inconsistent person. The consistent person is a person who can be trusted. No one is perfectly consistent and perfectly coherent. We all have blind spots, and that's part of being human. On a personal note, when I write outlines for these podcasts and proofread these outlines, I'm constantly looking for inconsistency and incoherence. My critical evaluation of my content is largely based on these two criteria. Consistency and coherence are always on my mind. This doesn't mean that I'll always be consistent and that I'll always be coherent. Again, I'm a finite and fallible human being, prone to error, prone to making mistakes. But this is a step in the right direction. Let's care about being consistent. In doing so, I think we'll be better friends, better parents, better spouses, better sons and daughters, and better people in the end. Thanks so much for listening. This episode, and all episodes of Thinker Sensitive, are available at thinkersensitive.com, iTunes, Spotify, and more. If you enjoy our content and wish to donate to help us grow our online community of thinkers, please visit thinkersensitive.com.